and gentlemen, and thank you for coming to today's event, Strengthening U.S. Partnerships in the Middle East. We will be starting in just a moment. We ask that everyone please silence your cell phones, and also we'll have a question and answer period following the discussion. We ask that you wait for the microphone to come to you, state your name and affiliation before your question. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon. My name is Brian Katsoulis. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. I want to thank all of you for coming today to what I'm sure will be a very interesting and lively conversation. It's a real treat to have our speakers here today, and I'm honored to have a conversation with a group of individuals who have a deep range of experiences and service to country. What we're going to do today, I'm going to say a few things about a recent report we put out, but we're going to have a conversation, first amongst us, and then we're going to open it up to all of you and run it till about 2 o'clock today. But our theme today is strengthening U.S. partnerships in the Middle East, which is a theme of the report which we released last week. And I'm pleased to introduce our panel. We have a full panel. One of our members will be here in about 5 minutes and is stuck in traffic. To my immediate right is Admiral James Winnefeld, who was the former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and has a long career in the U.S. military. To his right is Ambassador Yusuf Otaiba, who has been the Emirates ambassador since 2008. So how many years is that?
8 years.
8 years, yeah. That's a long period of time.
I haven't been fired yet.
And to his right is Ambassador Dina Kawar from Jordan. And Michael Morrell, the former deputy director of the CIA, is en route. He had a meeting in Old Town and is on his way and should be here in about 5-10 minutes. But we thought we'd get underway with the panel. And before I start the conversation out, I wanted to just say a few things about this report and what we did at the Center for American Progress in the process of trying to build this report. Three main reasons why we wanted to put something out 2 weeks before an election, where a lot of people, I think, are focused on who's going to win and what's going on here. First, we wanted to use the opportunity before even the election is decided to try to start a policy conversation about a long-term affirmative agenda for U.S. policy in the region. Not an easy thing to do. If you read Peter Baker's excellent piece in the New York Times this morning, I think there's a fair amount of fatalism and perhaps even cynicism in the United States about the Middle East. What we wanted to do is try to nest sort of the challenges and then the opportunities that the United States is facing in an argument, a geopolitical argument of why the Middle East still matters and why we can actually, working with partners, produce results. Second, and obviously I mentioned this, 2 weeks before an election, we have seen, I think, not as much of a substantive debate as many people would have hoped. And it's our report, and I think this discussion is our attempt to try to develop a different type of conversation, hopefully post-election, with a range of different friends. And over the last several months, I should say, and I know some are in the room, Center for American Progress has been working quietly and deliberating with friends of all different backgrounds, from the American Enterprise Institute to Hudson and others, to really wrestle with the challenges that America faces in the Middle East. The Middle East faces a lot of division, sectarianism, and tribalism. And I think we've seen some features of that in our own politics and policy discussions back here. So what we offer in the report, I think, is an argument that tries to deal with this issue of the divisions and how does a next administration, whomever wins, build a little bit more of public support for U.S. engagement. Again, not to remake the Middle East, but to the third point, to build partners and reaffirm partnerships. And I think no matter who wins, the next administration almost inevitably will be looking to build on the sorts of alliances and partnerships that have been developed over decades. But as we say in the report, even with some of our closest allies or partners in the region, there is a trust deficit. I think there's a two-way trust deficit that many in the region, either at the leadership level or the popular level, look at America with some questions, concerns, and skepticism. And I think it's quite clear here in America, especially 15 years after 9/11, there's real questions and an open debate about whether the Middle East matters. So our central focusing question, and when I talk to the panelists about this, based on their experience and the lessons they take from their experience serving their countries, from their own perspective, when they look at the last couple of years of U.S. engagement with the Middle East, what are the lessons that we can take with us as we look forward to a next administration? Again, it could be positive lessons or things that we could have both done differently. But I first wanted to turn to Admiral Winnefeld and get your perspective on military cooperation, because you've spent your lifetime and a career serving our country in the military, and thank you for that. But in this recent period, in our recent experience in the Middle East, what do you see as the major lessons learned that we need to carry forward with us as we try to address the challenges there?
Okay, and you were going to give us each about 5 or 7 minutes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, I'll start by saying that I am, by definition, politically agnostic. So you won't get me leaning in one direction or the other, which I think is important in our country's cultural heritage and our founding values, that military officers, including retired military officers, stay out of that mess. So I will do that religiously. And I'm going to approach the problem not only from the military piece, but I think from 4 sort of chunky areas that I think are important to answer the direct question of what advice would you give an incoming administration on how to grow and perpetuate our relationships with our very, very important partners in the Middle East. And I would start with the first big chunk, is that we have to understand that there are differences between the political and value systems between the United States and our partners. Not that either one is necessarily better, but that there are differences, and we need to account for those in the way we treat each other, and in particular, this big partner called the United States, as we deal with our partners in the Middle East. And within that, there are 4 things that I would think of that are very important for us. First of all, is to make sure that we can put things into perspective regarding values, relationships, and that sort of thing. And I reflect back on what Marty Dempsey and I brought to the table in terms of how we thought about crafting our military advice to the Secretary of Defense and the President. And we always thought of it as an abstract, enduring, and prioritized set of national security interests that went something like survival of our nation, prevention of catastrophic attacks on our nation, protection and preservation of the global operating system, secure, confident, reliable allies and partners, protection of American citizens abroad, and then last but not least, universal values, trying to extend and protect universal values. And as long as we have been in the Middle East, we've had this tension between trying to encourage partners and in some cases impose partners with those values at sometimes the expense of withholding things as the quid pro quo. And I just think we need to be careful with that, that we need to make sure we have that we still push what we believe in, but that we set it in the right order of priority, and that some of our other interests maybe come a little bit ahead of that. In that vein, I would also encourage that a next administration try not to be hypocritical or hubristic about that relationship. If I were a Martian looking down at our current electoral process, I couldn't be blamed for wondering if this is really the best system that's out there, even though we do believe that it is a good system. Others perhaps are not necessarily as convinced. I would also say that within the values space, that we need to realize that some things are more important than others. Personally, for me, I would place human rights before I would place democracy. I've always viewed democracy as sort of like life itself. It requires a particular soup and a particular spark to come in to fruition. And if you have the wrong soup or the wrong spark, you might get a mutant form. Look what happened in Gaza with Hamas. So I would be far less willing to try to push that on our partners than just basic human rights that we would want to work together with our partners in that vein. And then the other thing I would say in the political value system is we always do better when we're embedded with people rather than stiff-arming people. Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, I'll use a non-Middle Eastern example. I'll use Guatemala. Decades ago, there was a terrible human rights violation that occurred, and now we are prohibited from working embedded with the Guatemalan military. But we know that we help militaries in all ways, including in human rights, when we're with them, rather than when we're stiff-arming them. So I would encourage an incoming administration to say we're always better at this when we're embedded with people. The second big chunky thing is you've got to, particularly true in the Middle East, you've got to develop personal relationships. I know of no other region in the world where personal relationships matter more than they do in the Middle East. And that takes time, it takes effort, it takes sincerity, it takes maybe learning a touch of the language, hospitality, returned hospitality, and the like. So I think that's just terribly important and sometimes overlooked. The third big chunky thing is I think communicating early, often, and clearly is terribly important. And I would break that into three things. The first thing is it's very important that we listen well to our partners, particularly in the Middle East, to what their concerns are, understand through their eyes the history of the problems, understand through their eyes what they are really worried about and why, and what the context is. I think I could safely say that most of our Middle Eastern partners are principally concerned about Iran and extremism. Okay, let's dig a couple of layers deeper into that. What is it about Iran? Their people, their leadership, their history. What is it that we've done that has irritated our partners in that particular relationship? Same thing with extremism. Very important that we reach a common understanding with our partners in the Middle East over not just how we protect ourselves from extremism, but how we address the underlying causes of extremism. And that's where I think a very fruitful effort will lie with the next administration. The second part of communicating is doing a better job of explaining why we do what we do and what we don't do. I think we've missed a couple of opportunities in the not too recent past of just more clearly explaining to our partners what's going on in our minds when we decide to do something or not do something.
So you're saying we need to be clearer about...
Clearer and frequently communicating. And then the third piece of communicating is recognizing that we're never going to agree on everything between the United States and our Middle Eastern partners. But we should always agree on one thing and communicate it very clearly and very often, and that is when the chips are down, we've got your back. Yeah. Okay? And unless you're tired of hearing yourself say that, you're probably not saying it often enough, particularly to Middle Eastern partners who are living in this cauldron over there where they feel very, very deeply threatened. And then the last thing, and it comes out actually in the report, is encouraging our partners to continue to raise the bars they have been on working with each other. GCC cooperation and the like. That's been actually going pretty well, but we can do more in that regard. The last thing I'll say is there are also some things our partners can do. Not that they aren't already doing them, but let's continue to push the bar higher. One is to understand our crazy political system here. In this last 2 weeks, you're going to see frightened politicians shifting from one position to, we're already seeing that, aren't we? From one position to another. And I actually give our Middle Eastern partners a lot of credit for the patience with which they're listening to this going on. Hang in there, guys. We got your back. Deal with our crazy political system. Also, understand that we have a global role. We don't just have partnerships in the Middle East. We have partners across the world who count on us to help them to preserve the global operating system. And I think that is always good for a partner to remember. Understand our concerns on human rights, work with us on that, and we should both realize this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. It's just a sort of steady path. And then finally, that in a military sense, winning is not just about having the greatest equipment. It's about having the greatest operators to operate that great equipment. And there are gradients in the Middle East. I would point to, say, the UAE Air Force as one of the best air forces in the world. They've not only got great equipment, they've got great operators. But in that context, further down the line, there are other areas where we could be working on that operator piece And that means embedding with each other. It means even track 2 or track 3 efforts, where we can help each other actually get better at the kinds of things we need to do to be able to protect ourselves militarily. And I will stop there.
Great.
Thank you for the time.
Yeah.
But there's an awful lot we can do, and I look forward to the discussion and the opportunity to talk to the audience.
Great. That's a great set of comments, and we'll circle back to some of them in the conversation here. Sandy, appreciate it. So this notion that the U.S. needs to send this message that we've got your back. You've been here since 2008, and you've served with 2 different administrations here. What's your sense, Yusuf? Do you feel that message? And I think a lot of Americans, going back to this two-way trust deficit, wonder if some of our partners in the region have our back, and do we have clear enough communication? What are the big lessons that you've learned during your tenure here and as you look forward to a next administration?
Thank you, Brian. First, thank you for hosting us, and thank you for organizing this panel, but also thank you for the report on the Middle East, which I happen to completely agree with. Just a quick disclaimer. I just flew in from Abu Dhabi this morning, so if for any reason I'm incoherent or I fall asleep up here, it's not personal. What have we learned? We've learned that, like Admiral Winnefeld said, you cannot over-communicate. It's impossible to say the right things enough. And to anyone who's been in a relationship or a marriage, whenever there's a problem, you don't fix the problem by not talking to each other, right? You fix the problem by talking to each other. And I think with President Bush, we did, at the very end of the administration, have a very good understanding and very good communication. I think with the Obama administration, on a professional diplomatic level, we have good communication. So I have no issue of hearing the right messages from the administration. Problem is, the public doesn't. So every time I go home, when I'm sitting in an interagency meeting or in a briefing, I get questions that doubt whether the United States has our back or not. People in the region don't believe the way people here in Washington believe that. So there is a failure at the public level, I think, not so much at the diplomatic level. But I want to go back to why I think the theme of your report, or the conclusion of your report, is why the Middle East matters. The Middle East matters for 3 long-term trends that I see happening in our region over the past several years. First, it's Iran's increased influence, belligerence, undermining our interests as well as American interests in the region. I would have hoped that since the conclusion of the JCPOA, that Iran would have, at least the moderates, would have been empowered like many of us hoped. By any measure, Iran's behavior has gotten worse, whether it's missile tests, rhetoric, harassment of US Navy vessels, supplying weapons to proxies, or support for Hamas and Hezbollah and other known terrorist groups. I'm not even mentioning the PMFs and the Quds Force activities. So one long-term threat is Iran has been an increasingly bad actor in the region. 2, there's a proliferation of extremism. During the time of 9/11, there was Al-Qaeda. It was one group, everybody was focused on it, they were hiding in caves, and they tried to communicate covertly. And it was easy to go after a group that was, hiding. Today, there's ISIS, but I don't want us to get distracted by ISIS. There's at least another dozen groups operating underneath. They're not hiding. They're communicating. They're on social media. They're recruiting. And so the threat is very different. I think it's broader. It's more diverse. And the one mistake I don't want to see us make is to focus on ISIS, and then once we defeat ISIS, which I'm confident we will do, is to pack our bags and go home and say, mission accomplished, our job's over. Because that ensures that we're going to have another conversation just like this 2 years or 3 years from now saying, how do we defeat X or Y? This has to be a sustained campaign against extremism, against the ideology, against trying to prevent people from going to these groups or getting on the battlefield in the first place. And that's where I think we need to do a much, much better job. I think militarily, killing bad guys is almost easy at this point. I think preventing them from subscribing to that theory is the hard part, and that's a collective responsibility. And the third long-term trend is the erosion of the nation state. I think governments' ability to control their borders, to control their territories, is waning. And so we see, I think part of the rise of extremist groups and non-state actors is because governments are not as strong as they used to be. Control is not as strong as it used to be. So those are the three long-term trends I see happening in the region, and that's what requires US engagement. And at the risk of trying to solve every policy first, I think for the next administration, what I'd like to see is to rebuild those relationships, to rebuild the trust, to rebuild the level of cooperation that we have with you. And then once you have that, then it's easy to fix the policy. It's going to be much harder if you try to do it the other way around. Fix the Syria dilemma or the Libya dilemma without having your core US allies in the region on your side. And when I say core allies, I mean Saudi Arabia, Egypt, UAE, and Jordan. I think the first order for the new administration is try to get that band back together, operating on the same wavelength. And once we have that team, once we have that understanding, and once we have that trust, I think fixing some of the region's problems becomes much easier.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Yusuf. Ambassador Kouar, welcome. It's really great to see you again. And the question to you, and I think the U.S. and Jordan has had a deep and long relationship going back to King Hussein and decades. And long before there was an anti-ISIL coalition, you know, we were building and working together. When you look at the challenges today that are on your border, Syria to the north, the unresolved Israel-Palestine conflict to the west, and Iraq to the east, to this question of the U.S.-Jordanian partnership, not only how does your country benefit, but then what's in it for America? And I'm going to come back to that question because, again, I think we've seen in our election campaign and even our policy discussions a question of should we even stay engaged? And from your perspective in Jordan, what would you say to Americans to those two questions?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. This is my first time in a think tank, so you're the first. I'm not like him since 2008. I just arrived a month or two. Hello.
Hi.
You found your way.
Yes.
Well, just a few points, general points before I answer to your questions. First of all, I think that the Middle East has had a conjuncture of many elements, and which has complicated the situation. But there are good news there. I know it doesn't look like it, but I will come to that. First of all, we are dealing with what I call unfinished business. This nation building, the issue of minorities, the issue of communitarism, what is the best system to have, all these things that was supposed to be fixed 100-some years ago is coming back in our faces, and this is unfinished business. Second of all, you spoke about democracy, your neighbor spoke about human rights. I would think justice is the issue. Mm-hmm. And social justice is the issue, because what we saw in the Arab Spring was lack of social justice. People were not claiming democracy as you perceive it in the West as much as they were claiming social justice, and we saw that throughout. Third of all, there is a surge, and Yusuf mentioned it, the ISIL and non-state actors that we're seeing all over the Middle East and beyond. And that comes at a time when there is a communication revolution, which makes every time you talk, you write, you do a Twitter, people see it in 3.5 seconds. So there's room for propagating bad propaganda. And for that to happen, there's obviously people who are waiting out there wanting to hear it. And I agree with what Yusuf said, and maybe just to elaborate, if I understood him well, is that even if you get rid of ISIL, which we will eventually, we have not to say, okay, fine, it's over. There is a public opinion, there is public anger, and there are people that are waiting and expecting. Waiting and expecting what? First of all, waiting and expecting issues that have not been resolved, including which we stopped mentioning the Israeli-Palestinian issue. It has become like an old story. Nobody likes to talk about it, but it will come back in our faces, and it's something that needs to be dealt with. Waiting for the systems to become more responsive and for more reforms, and they expect a lot more. People are more educated. If they're not more educated, they're more informed. And people who are more informed without education are just as demanding, if not more. Mm-hmm. So all these issues need to be dealt with. Now, there are fires in the Middle East right now, and if you want to deal with reforms, if you want to deal with looking at unfinished business, we need first to put off the fires. And I can say from my short experience at this UN Security Council, during a year and a half, I could say that we spend most of our times talking about crisis and fires here and there, and there was never a time to think or reflect or to say what we need to do. And second of all, and if the United States and the Russians do not have a good relationship, good working relationship, everybody feels it. And every time a session in the UN Security Council was on, and there was the Americans and the Russians and the Americans, and how they decide to deal with it, it reflects on everybody else. And if you try to hide this fact, we're not being fair or to the situation. And another thing that needs to be done, once fires are turned off and once we turn ourselves to discussing and resolving issues, there's a need for a bit of calm and quiet diplomacy. And I feel like we're missing the quiet diplomacy of the old days. There is no more quiet diplomacy. I mean, nowadays there are 500 meetings a day. I actually don't know how our poor ministers manage to travel the world and go to all these meetings. I've assisted to some of them, and to say the quiet truth, some of them can be done in a different way. And there is no need to be always talking to the world to show that we're working. We need to work. And I'm not saying in that there's not work being done, but I think there needs to be a different approach to how diplomacy is carried out. And that goes to the next step, which is trying to see how we deal with the Middle East in the long term. We should not be in a reactive mode, but in an active mode, in trying to deal with issues and see how can we bring back some sort of normality in these states, take into account all the minorities, take into account the different grievances, the different requirements of different factors in society, to see how we can deal with that. And only in a quiet and non-reactive way we can work on that. And I think that this is a lot of work, but the good news that I wanted to say before at the beginning of my speech is that countries like ours, you mentioned them, we acknowledge and know our weaknesses, and we know what we want to do, and we're far beyond what anybody can think. We know our weaknesses. We have the will. We have the political will. We want to move. It's not always easy. Now, when you asked me a question about Jordan, you said all the challenges to the north, to the east, to the south. You forgot to mention the most important challenge as well for us is the economic situation. Yeah. Because economically, we're a poor country. We're having to deal with 1.3 million Syrians in our country, not to mention the other nationalities that are there. And Jordan right now is actually the one country in the world that has most refugees if you count everybody. And all of that is eating up from the little resources that we have. 25% of our GDP is going to cover for refugees and for making sure that they have a decent life, because we know a refugee stays at least 17 years in a country. So there's education, there's health, and there's employment. And all of that is the promise that we did in the London conference in February, but we cannot do that alone. And so the last point I would like to say is that problems are not anymore confined to one country. The problems are borderline, they move on. And that is, if there is a problem with the Syrian thing, is that we did not realize that this Syria problem has moved all over the world. Look at Brexit, the refugees, the problems everywhere, the fires it has opened. So nobody now has the luxury of saying, oh, the war is there, we cannot deal with it. No, the war is not there. It's here at home.
Right. That's, I think, a very important point, Ambassador. And I remember a few years ago people talking about containment as an idea, the containment of the Syria crisis, and I think the facts demonstrate that I think it's very difficult to have that as a reality. Michael, the ambassador talked about 500 meetings happening, and you're no longer in government, but you have a lot of meetings, and we're glad you were able to make it here.
My deepest apologies to everybody.
Just in the nick of time. We've been talking about the theme of partnerships and sort of looking at what we can learn from the last several years of U.S. engagement in the Middle East. And you've served for years at the senior levels of our intelligence community. I thought maybe you could provide us with your snapshot of where the region is at right now And then to the question of what do we do about it? Because there is, I think, a general attitude of maybe we should just be hands-off here. Maybe we should stay above the fray. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation.
Sure, thank you. So I am actually optimistic about the Middle East, believe it or not. I think that the next president of the United States is going to have a real opportunity to work with our friends in the Middle East to shape the future in a very positive way, and let me tell you why I think that. First of all, just to build on what the ambassador said, I see three large dynamics in the Middle East that have brought us to where we are today. I think it's very easy to look at the crises of the day, as the ambassador talked about: Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. I think it's important to step back and say, okay, where did all this come from? And I think there's three dynamics. I think they're long-term. I think they're deeply seated. And I think they all have to be dealt with. The first one is the failure of governance in many countries in the region. And I define the failure of governance as the failure to create the widespread perception that your kids are going to have a better life than you have. It's fundamental in any society in terms of engagement, in terms of believing that your government is serving you. This is not about democracy. This is about the government serving the people and delivering them that perception that their kids are going to have a better life. That, to me, was what brought upon the Arab Spring. People were not in Tahrir Square asking for democracy. They were in Tahrir Square asking for their kids to have a better life than them. Big issues surrounding that governance. But I think for the first time, there are a number of countries in the region, led by UAE, led by Jordan, and increasingly led by Saudi Arabia, who want to get their arms around this governance problem. The one country that is still working on it is Egypt, and we all need to help Egypt get there. It's so important. The second issue, second big dynamic, is what's often referred to, and I'm going to say this and then correct it, what's often referred to as the struggle between Iran and the Sunni Gulf states, struggle for influence in the region. You often hear that. It is the wrong way to think about it. It is a desire on the part of the Iranians to be the hegemonic power in the region, and their efforts to achieve that, and it is the Sunni Gulf states pushing back against that. That is what's happening. This is long term. It is a Cold War that's turned into a hot war with proxies. It has fed sectarianism across the region. It's created many of the problems that we've seen. It has to be dealt with. And then the third issue is the rise of violent jihad. Some people call it Islamic extremism. I call it the rise of violent jihad. It dates back to 1979 on both the Sunni side and the Shia side. It's long-standing. There are fundamental issues at work. Those are the three big issues that have to be dealt with. And two of them have to be dealt with by the countries in the region. The fundamentals of violent jihad have to be dealt with by the countries in the region, and the fundamental issues around governance have to be dealt with by the countries in the region. The United States of America and the West cannot solve those problems, and we actually shouldn't be messing around in those problems. The one place where the United States can play a very significant role is pushing back on the Iranians. The United States of America pushed back against Soviet malign behavior wherever it was happening in the world. The United States of America has historically not pushed it back against Iranian malign behavior, and we need to do that. So why am I so optimistic after just telling you these three big dynamics at play? I'm optimistic because the situation we find ourselves in the Middle East, what many people perceive to be a crisis, is occurring at the same time that there is a strong belief among the leadership in the Middle East that the United States has forgotten them, has abandoned them, is not leading, is not taking the leadership role that is required to help bring stability to the region, which is occurring at the same time that there's a transition in government here. So you put those three things together, and I actually think there's this great opportunity for the next president of the United States to go to the Middle East and to say, we're back. We're going to lead again. Here's what we're going to do, and it's going to focus on pushing back against the Iranian behavior, working with you. And here's what we need you to do on the governance side and on the violent jihad side. And I think there's an opportunity for a real partnership there on all three of those issues, and I think we should take advantage of it.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I want to pick up on something you just said there in terms of pushing back against Iran, and I think it's certainly a feature of the debate that we should be having if we didn't have this type of election that we've had here in this country, one focused on substance. What precisely do you mean? And it's a question to you, but how much further do we push? What would you do in addition to what President Obama has tried to do with the framework of the GCC summits and trying to put things into place? So that's one question related to it. And then second, how would all of you address some of the fires where Iran's hand is obviously in play? Syria being one of them, Yemen is another. And quite frankly, in recent months, there's been an honest debate about whether our partners in some of these instances are actually contributing to escalation or de-escalation of those conflicts. So how do you navigate that? The precise question is then, what would you do differently on Iran than President Obama has?
I think there needs to be, a very serious policy discussion about exactly how you do this. And I'm not going to pretend that I've had that policy discussion or I've thought this through completely. But I think there's two buckets of things. One is sanctions that bite. The sanctions that we put on Iran over the nuclear program strangled them and brought them to the negotiating table. I think we should think about a set of sanctions that make them think twice about their malign behavior in the region. And I think those sanctions should be meaningful. And then I think the second bucket is pushing back on individual Iranian behavior. So for example, this is just an example, and I know there's issues of international law here, and Sandy will jump in on this, I'm sure. But ships leave Iran on a regular basis carrying arms to the Houthis in Yemen. I would have no problem from a policy perspective of having the U.S. Navy board those ships, and if there's weapons on them for the Houthis, turn those ships around and send those ships back to Iran. I think that's the kind of action, tough action, that will get the attention of the Iranians and will get the attention of our friends in the region to say the Americans are now serious about helping us deal with this problem.
I'd say a couple things. One, yes, I am going to talk about international law in a second. But I would say one of the things that we need to understand is that Iran understands the language of power. And they also understand the language of weakness. We saw during Ernest Will, the tanker wars and that sort of thing, that whenever we pushed back hard on Iran, they got it and they kind of went back into their shell. And in that context, I think we have to be careful to not allow ourselves to be held hostage by the fear of losing the nuclear agreement. It's there. If Iran wants to scrap that thing, it's going to be more their problem than it is ours. I think it's a good agreement, but we should not, avoid taking strong action against Iranian malign behavior because we're worried that they may abandon the nuclear agreement. I don't think they will. It's very much in their favor to have that. The other thing, speaking to international law, I think it's very often lost on the blogosphere, on the media intercourse that you see, and the like, of the absolute influence that international law has on the decision-making apparatus inside this country. And it goes all the way back to the Bush administration when you look at how hard they tried and in fact succeeded in getting a UN Security Council before they invaded Iraq in 2003. And that has a profound influence that is very underappreciated. To what Michael was speaking to, a very, very strict interpretation of international law would say you can't interdict an Iranian ship on the high seas unless one of three things is at stake. Either you've been invited into somebody's country, well, that's on the high seas, it's not in anybody's country. You have a UN Security Council resolution that allows you to do it, which you will never get. Or the third one is if it's in self-defense, including collective self-defense. my opinion, and I think Michael would agree with me, is that we could probably be a little bit more liberal in our interpretation of what collective self-defense means when Iran is shipping arms to the Houthis to operate in Yemen, which threatens the whole region. So I think we could be a little bit more forward-leaning in that area, with the caveat that you have to be careful when you push against international law for two reasons. One is, one of the reasons why this country has more allies than any country in history is because people expect us to adhere to things like international law, to the global operating system. And the other thing is, when you do step into that gray zone, and it is a gray zone, it's not always black and white, then all you're doing is giving license to people like Vladimir Putin and others to do the same thing. Now, they're going to do that anyway, as we've seen in places like Crimea and elsewhere, but it still is good to be on the high side of that argument. But I think that stepping into that gray zone is very much in our interest, and we should take the next administration should take a very close look at how we interpret that particular thing, as Michael pointed out.
Great. Ambassador, do you want to add anything, either of you?
Obviously, I agree with my colleagues, but I think trying to identify some low-hanging fruit of how you push back against Iran,
Yeah.
I think there's a few ideas that come to mind. I don't think we're doing enough to push back on Iranian support of terrorist groups that are on the United States group list of terrorists, Hezbollah, Hamas. The Shia PMFs are largely an Iranian creation. These are things have gone, in my opinion, largely unchecked. So I think this is the simplest and most direct thing that we can do to kind of counter Iranian influence, whether it's the Houthis, the PMFs, Hamas, or Hezbollah. It's a little more challenging when you get into third-party countries like Iraq and Lebanon and Syria. But I think that one makes more sense and is probably a little more direct to do. But I think, like Admiral Winfeld said, we look like we are afraid of the nuclear deal. Mm-hmm. We're afraid of the nuclear deal falling apart, and so it looks like we're looking the other way and trying not to attribute some of this behavior to Iran. Mm-hmm. I see this every day. And so sending clear messages, not just to your friends about what we're going to do together, but also to your adversaries in the region is going to be very, very important.
And what about the question that I raised, that some people have about operations that some of our partners, and the Emirates has been involved in Yemen. And as we've seen, with especially recent months, just serious questions about where this is all going. Is it going towards supporting a peace process? Is it supporting sort of stability in the long run? How would you respond, and how should a new administration have that discussion with our partners in the region?
First, let me start by just providing a little context of why we're in Yemen. We are in Yemen because the Houthi tribe, the tribe that represents 3% of the population of Yemen, overtook the country, ran through the country. The legitimate government of President Hadi fled and ran into Saudi Arabia. The legitimate government demanded that the GCC intervene militarily. There was a request, an invitation. Second, after the invitation was sent out, we went to the UN Security Council and got Security Council Resolution 2216, which provided a mandate for our operations in Yemen. So there is a clear legal context of why we're in Yemen. Now, keep in mind this is the first time I think an Arab coalition has fought a war largely without the United States. The UAE has been in 6 coalitions with the US. Most of the time the US does the heavy lifting, but we are in there front and center. This is the first time we are front and center and the US is providing support. So yes, there's going to be a learning curve involved. But let me make as clear as I can why it was important for the UAE to make this decision to go into Yemen. We were not, under any circumstances, going to allow Iran to replicate a Hezbollah in Yemen by using the Houthis. And that's exactly what they tried to do. You can argue that Hezbollah is probably one of Iran's most successful creations. They're trying to replicate it in Iraq with the Shia militias. They're trying to replicate it in Yemen with the Houthis. And we were not going to allow for this to happen on the border of a country that produces 10 million barrels a day and that is home to Mecca and Medina. And if that decision upsets some of our friends in the West, then so be it. But this is a red line for us. This is our backyard. And it's incredibly important for us. And it goes back to a point that was made earlier. There has to be a recognition of what's important for us, just like we recognize what's important for you. And so any relationship, if it's not a two-way street, if there is not a recognition and understanding of why Yemen is important to us, then it's not going to work. And yes, mistakes were made. there's often steps taken to fix those mistakes. And that's the time when you have a very tough private conversation. That's the time when someone goes over there and say, hey, this is difficult for us, we need to fix this. But we still have your back.
Can I add something?
Sure.
The reason why is because in the Security Council, I followed the Yemen file from the very beginning, and the vote on 2216 was under the presidency of Jordan. So I remember very well the importance of this resolution. And I must say that we tend also to forget the spoilers who are in Yemen, who played a very big and dirty role. But I think what is sad about the Yemeni story is that it started becoming Yemen on one side and Syria on the other, and sort of pointing fingers on and blame game between the two main countries. So it's very important to come back to the fact, as Yusuf said, which is to take into consideration our security interests and also not to be in the Middle East playing as if there are no human beings with the rights for people to live in a normal setting. And it's very, very important that that happens quickly. I would also add to the Yemen danger is that you have Al-Qaeda infiltrated in the south of Yemen, but Yemen is also on the road to Africa, and ISIL is not there yet, but they could one day, we could imagine, by them leaving Mosul and the north of Syria, going through that part into Somalia and then the other part of Africa. So we should never forget that there's a triple problem for the whole world. And again, going back to the point, as I said, we cannot say this is a problem there. No, it's everybody's problem.
And I can just add one thing. When we deployed in Afghanistan for 12 years with the United States. Every once in a while, there would be a strike by the coalition against a hospital or clinic or some kind of accident. What do you think public opinion inside our countries looked like when the United States bombed something by mistake? What do you think the pressure looked like in our countries when we were in the same position? Did we say, hey, we can't do this, we have to walk away? Or did we say, no, this is too much pressure, we're going to leave the campaign? It's a two-way street. I go back to this point. What happens here happens there. And unless there is a reciprocal understanding of what's important for us, it is going to trigger a reciprocal reaction.
Yeah.
I mean, JASTA is a perfect example. JASTA just passed Congress a few weeks ago. And everybody I met in Congress who we were trying to understand how this unfolds said, oh no, it's not a good law, it's flawed, we need to fix it. But you have to understand, it's political and it's emotional. And it's 9/11 anniversary, and it's an election year, and it's very tough. Why don't we think it's going to trigger a political and emotional reaction in the region? Why is it only political and emotional here? Why are we expected to behave rationally when here people are behaving emotionally? And I think this fundamental lack of understanding is part of the problem, and this is one of the things that I think needs to be addressed.
Before I open it up to questions, I wanted to ask one more longer-term question. And Ambassador Kouar, you talked about the need for quiet discussions and quiet diplomacy. It's something we put in our report and say rather than have media diplomacy and being reactive to crises, having some planning between our countries, the U.S. and some of our key partners in the region, to really define some agendas. And in my view, I think a lot of those agendas on the issues of governance, of political legitimacy, the crisis of the nation state in certain parts, those ideas largely have to come from the region. But where do you see, and to the other panelists, where do you see the role of the U.S. in that? Is there no role? Is the conclusion that we draw from the last 15 years, particularly the Bush Freedom Agenda, and some of the efforts, to try to elevate human rights in the discussions? I have a view on that, and I think it's still important to try to keep it in the discussion, but do it in a way that builds trust as opposed to sends a message that I think some in places like Egypt feel like we're trying to break down or undermine their systems, but I think the intent is often misrepresented. I think so the key question is on those longer enduring challenges and a long-term agenda. What do you see the role for where the U.S. is in all of this, and who has that vision?
Well, the U.S. is a major player and a major partner, and we are thankful to many of the things they help us out with and do in our region. It's just a question of approach. When I spoke about quiet diplomacy, I meant slow diplomacy, and slow doesn't make it slow in time. We have no time to waste. But taking the time to solving the real on-the-ground problems and see how we can go out. But that cannot be done by the U.S. itself. It has to be done by the countries themselves, by the peoples themselves, and in participation not only of governments, but of also the public opinion, the everybody in each country. And that's part of the reforms that need to be done, and that many countries, including mine, are trying to do, which is to have a voice for everybody in political parties, in the civil society. And I think that's why it's what I call slow diplomacy, because it's not something that you will get. And the problem is that we're always running in time, short time, because we have elections, because we have this, because we have, and that's why it has to be quiet and silent, because then it will not depend on anything else but what is happening in these closed doors, because we cannot be doing politics that will solve a problem just for 2, 3, 4 years. Look at the Iranian issue that we spoke in Syria. I mean, supposing the Syrian political track gets on its way, it will take years, because it's not easy to get a new government participation. And even if you get it into a form, there's trial period, things go wrong, things go right. What is happening is that the Iranian presence on the ground will become a factor that will become even more noticeable after, and that we have to deal with. So we came to fix a situation in Syria. Now we have another problem that we have to deal with, and that's why it's spreading the cards on the table and saying, you know, we want to achieve ABC, good governance, like you said, is very important, but also a place for all minorities, a place for everybody in each society to exist, and regional respects of borders, of rights, and there's room for everybody. I mean, the area has so much wealth and so much youth and so much intelligence and so much education. It's beyond what people know, and that's something we need to work on.
I don't know if Michael or Ambassador Sandy want to add to this, but you raised the issue of Egypt and the centrality, I think, of Egypt, which is often seen, I think, as either number 6 or 7. And our team at the center has spent a lot of time over the years, but especially this year, looking at Egypt. And I know the UAE has been deeply involved in trying to support what's going on there in terms of governance reform, economic reform, and other things. When you think about the next steps for a new U.S. administration, what do you think needs to be done there? Because you certainly have been actively involved. And if you look at your memoir and your most recent book, you were there in those confusing periods where there was leadership changes and things like this. What's next on Egypt? And then I'll open it up to the crowd.
So I think it's a two-track approach. One track is to openly and aggressively support the positive threads. So all those things you just talked about, economic reform and entrepreneurship and what young people are trying to do in society, you openly embrace those and support them. And on the other hand, the other thread is you quietly, behind closed doors, critique where you need to critique. So I think you have to do both at the same time. And sometimes I think we find it difficult to continue with the positive inducements when we're frustrated by some of the negative things happening, and I don't think you can let that happen.
I want to try to explain why Egypt and Saudi Arabia are so important for the UAE. I think people look at numbers, they look at demographics, they look at oil, and they assume those are the reasons why Saudi Arabia and Egypt are so central to the stability of the Middle East. For us, it's actually very different. For us, Saudi Arabia and Egypt are the pillars of Islam. Whether it's Mecca and Medina in Saudi or Al-Azhar University, the oldest Islamic academic institution in the world, that's headquarters for Islam. And that has a direct impact on how Islam is taught, shown, explained. So those countries remaining stable are us trying to protect Islam and keeping Islam as a moderate religion and not being hijacked by the ISISes of the world. One of our biggest fears was when the Muslim Brotherhood was in power in Egypt, was that they would infiltrate Al-Azhar and produce clerics that call for jihad. And as bad as Syria is today, if the Muslim Brotherhood was in Egypt today, you wouldn't have 30,000 people fighting with ISIS. You'd have 300,000 or 500,000. And so protecting Islam is why Egypt and Saudi Arabia is important. I think it's very important for everyone to understand that. And that's why we must ensure that Egypt succeeds, that we must ensure that Saudi Arabia is part of the solution and not being perceived as part of the problem, which is how they're perceived today.
Mm-hmm. Great. Do you want to add anything? We're going to open it up to questions. Do we have a mic? Down front here. Josh? And please tell us who you are, your affiliation, and we're looking for questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your time today. My name is Josh Rogan. I'm with the Washington Post. I'd like to ask you a specific question about Syria. We have a new president coming in. If Hillary Clinton is elected, she's promised to institute no-fly zones, safe zones inside Syria, increase arms to the moderate opposition, use pressure to coerce Assad and Russia to what she calls a serious negotiation. Even CAP has put out in the report the idea of bombing the Syrian Air Force in order to prevent them from perpetrating mass atrocities on civilians, especially in Aleppo. Where are your countries, Mr. and Ms. Ambassador, on these options? Would you support these specific options? Would you commit your national resources to enforcing these safe zones? And would you commit your national troops to keeping them protected? And for Mr. Morella, your ideas about increasing sanctions on the Iranians and boarding Iranian ships, are these the official positions of the Hillary Clinton campaign? Thank you.
So I'll just go first and say no, they are not. I don't work for the campaign. I don't speak for the campaign. I speak for myself.
On your questions, you put out a pretty broad palette of ideas and actions to take, but I will avoid getting in the policy prescription business 2 weeks before an election. I'll wait until there's a president, and we will learn together what the president's appetite is for doing or not doing. But I think the approach that I proposed is what I would still recommend. Bring us together. Sit us together in a room and say, we're back, we're going to work together. How do we fix this? How do we fix that? And I think once everybody understands that we are going into the same direction or going to the same objective, it'll be much easier to find the right tactics to use to get to that objective. Right now, our tactics are all over the place because everyone is going in a different direction. And they haven't been brought into a huddle where one play is called. And I think that's what the next president needs to do first.
But I mean, Yusuf answered, and it's true though that the opposition requires and mandates more support. It's very true that this point needs to be addressed as well, because on the ground having troops on the ground is just as important as a no-fly zone.
Yeah, the no-fly zone is a very interesting question. If somebody were to say, you know, I'm going to enter office and we're going to have a no-fly zone, period, I would, as a military advisor, come back and say, well, tell me what problem you're trying to solve, and then we'll give you some options on how to do that. Just prescripting the tactical answer is not necessarily the way to go, because you have to consider what goes along with that. Be careful what you ask for, you might just get it. We could put a no-fly zone over portions of Syria. It will, and again, if you are going to recommend the use of force, you have to balance national interests versus the cost, versus the risk to our people, versus the opportunity cost elsewhere in the world if something were to come up where you needed to be able to use that force component, versus international law, and there are questions of international law there, and a whole host of other factors there. And I'm a veteran of the no-fly zone in southern Iraq. I actually wrote the deployment order for that and then actually got to fly in it. And there was one surface-to-air missile battery in southern Iraq, and we had guns drawn ready to go for it in case they tried to do anything. Of course, they didn't. In the meantime, right beneath our noses, Saddam was able to drain the swamps and do almost anything that he wanted to do. So the question is, was it effective? And then what is the real risk associated with putting one in one of the best integrated air defense systems in the world? And I couldn't agree more with the ambassador that if you're looking for a safe zone, that does not equal no-fly zone. You have to have control of the ground, because you can be there flying around No Syrian or Russian airplane in the air, which is hard enough, and you can just watch artillery, ground forces, chemical weapons, you name it, underneath you. It takes a more comprehensive and less simplistic solution than just no-fly zone.
But the broader point, though, is that in addition to a huddle on diplomacy, which seems to happen quite a lot, if there are efforts to try to shape the landscape and the conflict, it needs to be by, with, and through, and coordinated very closely.
And the question also is, if your overall strategic intent is to force a meaningful negotiation about the future of Syria with all the appropriate players, you need to be able to apply pressure in order to make that happen. That's the question. How do you apply that pressure? Not so much, do we do a no-fly zone?
Great, thanks.
Aberdeen, the Capital Trust Group. One issue that you touched upon, but I think needs more emphasis, that is job creation, job creation. You have millions of young men and women who are educated and who don't have jobs. So I think the next administration has to tackle that issue. We should think about a Marshall Plan between the US, Europe, and the GCC for countries like Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and the other country that should be paid more attention to is Morocco. Morocco, in my view, is a pivotal country in the North Africa region.
Great. So that was more of a comment on a Marshalling Plan.
Michael and I have written about this, and I think it's even more than the economic piece, although the economic piece is important. It's addressing all of the underlying causes of extremism that you can find, some of which are economic, some of which are informational, some of which are extremist clerics, some of them are what we call jihadi cool in social media. There's a whole host of those, and I think that we need to come together as allies and partners in a society in addressing those underlying causes. That is the long-term solution to this thing. Yes, we have to ask ourselves, how do we protect ourselves in the near term? But the real long-term question is this generational issue that we can solve together, principally, as Michael pointed out, in the Middle East. But we ought to be asking ourselves, what can we do to help them?
And education.
Yeah.
Education is huge. Yeah. Right there? Yes.
Greg Aftendilian with American University. Thank you, Brian, for hosting this panel. Thank you for the guests as well. My question deals with Iran. We all understand that Iranian foreign policy and security policy is inherently against many of our friends and allies in the Middle East, but the population of Iran, the young people especially, want to reach out to the West. So don't we have a certain dilemma here? Because on the one hand, we say Iran's policies are objectionable, but we still don't want to alienate the young people who want to have a better relationship. And we all saw stories and images when the interim nuclear deal was announced. You had dancing in the streets of Tehran by young people trying to say, we want this outreach to the West. So how do we balance this for our long-term interests? Thank you.
Sir, I agree. I don't think the UAE has any issue with the Iranian people, whether the ones who live in Iran or even the Iranians who live in the UAE. Our issue is the policies of their government, a revolutionary government, an ideological government, a government whose constitution enshrines exporting the revolution. That's where we have an issue. If the young people ran Iran, I think we would be fine. But we saw what happened. People always think that the Arab Spring started in Tunisia. I'd like to remind those people that it started in Tehran in June of 2009 when people protested the election results and they were massacred in the streets, massacred. And so you saw the voice of the people and then you saw the government's reaction. So our issue is with the government and their policies, not with the people. And until the government reflects the will of their people, then I think we're going to continue to have that issue.
And I would add, I agree 100% with what Yusuf said. I would add that I fear that the next generation of leadership in Iran is actually going to be more hardline than the current generation of leadership, contrary to the conventional wisdom. And the reason the next generation of leadership is going to be more hardline is because that's the Iran-Iraq war generation. That's the Ahmadinejad generation. He was early, right? He was a young president. That generation is going to be more hardline because that generation blames the United States of America for our support of Iraq during the Iran-Iraq war, and they despise us for it. And so I think we're going to go through some even rougher times here with the next generation of leadership than we will before we get to some of these younger people down the road.
The one question that I want to probe on here, because you mentioned the Green Revolution in 2009 and talked about what happened inside of Iran, and especially for those of you who served in the U.S. government and reflecting back on how the U.S. approached that. And it comes to the point of human rights, which you raised in your introductory remarks. How do you balance these tensions of diplomacy and trying to engage as well as push back against malign behavior when you think about what's next? If, hypothetically, with the elections in Iran next year, if there is a similar sort of uprising, do we run the same playbook as we did in 2009, which was, I think, quiet and to stay on the sidelines? I don't have an answer. I'm not trying to lead you, but when you reflect on that moment, did we miss an opportunity, or was that the right choice in 2009 for U.S. policy?
So I wasn't sitting at the table in 2009.
Yeah.
Right? I was in a different place. But your question is really interesting because if you look back, I can think of only one time in the last 30 years where the United States has pushed back significantly against the Iranians. The embassy bombing in Beirut, the Marine barracks bombing, both of those tied back to Tehran. The United States did not respond. The Reagan administration did not respond. The Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia tied back to the Iranians. The Clinton administration did not respond. The Iranian support for Shia militia in Iraq that killed thousands of American soldiers in Iraq, neither the Bush administration nor the Obama administration responded to those Iranian provocations. And I've been struggling with trying to understand why so many administrations did not push back on direct attacks on the United States of America. And I think one of the reasons has to do with your question. I think there is a hope, right? We're always holding out the hope that the Iranian public is going to be able to change the behavior of its government, and it hasn't happened yet. And I think to some extent we're still hoping.
I think the Iranian public has learned to live their life the way they feel. I mean, they've adapted to the system in their own comfort, which is something that we don't see in the Arab world. It's complete. We have the feeling that the revolution that they've been instigating and pushing throughout the Arab world has gotten to us now, and so we're living the Iran style in our minds as if it were 30 years ago, whereas the Iranians have found their way of dealing with it, and there's a certain freedom that they found within barriers and limits, and that's something interesting.
I don't know the answer, but I do know that, I'll use Admiral Winfeld's analogy. If I was a Martian watching the events of the Middle East for the last few years, and I saw the U.S. reaction to the events in Iran, and then shortly after watched the U.S. reaction to the events in Egypt, I would be a very confused Martian. I would think it was the other way around. I would think Iran is the U.S. ally, but Egypt is the adversary. And so I don't know what the right answer is. I know it does send signals of confusion.
As I mentioned earlier, and Michael laid out the litany of times we haven't responded, and as I mentioned in my remarks before you got here, Michael, Iran understands power. And I think that there are opportunities lost. One of the things that's layered on top of your concerns about what about this younger generation of Iranians? And by the way, I'm reminded of Bob Gates' famous adage, I'm waiting for the elusive Iranian moderate. I'm waiting for the elusive Iranian, moderate youth to grow up, and they did try, I grant you that in 2009, but a lot of these people as they get older get hardened, just like they do in any society. But now, layered on top of that concern, we have the nuclear agreement. I said we can't be held hostage to the nuclear agreement. We have to push back when pushback is warranted, or we're just not going to be able to accomplish what we said we were going to accomplish in the nuclear agreement. That was, it's a good agreement, and on top of that was, and by the way, we're going to push back on Iranian malign behavior. You have to do both of those things or it doesn't work.
So I'm having a little hard time seeing everybody's hands out here. We are the Center for American Progress, so we encourage pluralism and inclusivity. We've only had men ask questions. So I see actually a woman here in the back. There we go. Billy's pointing, and then I'll try to get to all the hands that are around.
Get all three of us. Kim Dozier with the Daily Beast. You've talked about how the past administration, without naming it, hasn't been forward-leaning enough to fix some of the problems in the Mideast. But one of the things the Obama administration always says is they've been trying to encourage regional powers to take responsibility instead of always turning to Washington to solve everything. Do you think some of their hands-off approaches have helped strengthen that regional impetus to step forward and solve the problems?
Who was the question to?
I'd love to hear from all
Okay.
four of you, but especially you, Ambassador Otaiba,
Sure.
and the ambassador from Jordan.
Of course. I think that the issues of governance that Mike touched on and Ambassador Kowar touched on, whether it's improved governance, security, education, stamping out corruption, these are all things that we have to do. That we would love for the United States to help us, but if they don't, it's not their responsibility. It's not anyone's responsibility. It is ours. This falls on our shoulders, and those are things we should and have to do for the betterment of our countries and our people, period. No foreign policy attached. Now, I do think that there are some very talented and very, very wise leaders coming up in the Middle East. I think King Abdullah of Jordan has been leading the pack on being a reformist, progressive leader in the region. I think he's kind of like the team captain that we all look up to. But there's also Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid and Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE. There's Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. And if you ask anyone who lives in Saudi Arabia, they would probably tell you that they've seen more reforms in the last year and a half in Saudi Arabia than they have in the last 50 years. So changes are actually occurring in some of these very, very important countries. I don't think we're paying enough attention to it, but I assure you, these issues are for us to deal with, and many of those leaders are actually doing just that as we speak.
So, Yusuf answered it. What can I add?
Well, I think Kim's question, if I could try to reiterate, is this sort of posture of the Obama administration taking a step back. Has this, and tell me if this is wrong, has this incentivized? I mean, what we identify in our report, and a lot of people have analyzed, is that there's a more assertiveness in the region. You said so yourself about Yemen and other things. Is it having the positive effect in that sense, or is it just out of sheer sort of desperation, that's driving it?
I think it's doing that when it comes to external threats. When it comes to the Irans and the Libyas and supporting Egypt, yes. I think on the internal issues, that was going to happen regardless, and it has been happening. I think it started many, many years ago. We started doing economic reform plans in the UAE 15 years ago. Education reform happened right after 9/11. So I don't think this is a reflection of the Obama administration policies. I think internal issues we see as a priority for us. External issues, or cooperation on external issues, is you can say is a byproduct of that.
And I would add what I earlier said, is that wars and crisis areas are not immune and cannot remain in the area. We saw with the Syrian issue, and therefore, whether we like it or not, everybody has to be involved, and the U.S. and the first, and they have been. I mean, I've never seen Secretary Kerry has been running non-stop, trying to get a deal, at least for now, to stop the fire and get in humanitarian aid and stop what is happening in Aleppo. But you cannot say, well, we can do with a crisis like Syria without American presence. And I mean, the Russians are there as well. So
I think what you both said there in terms of this posture by the Obama administration has motivated this sort of action, but yet you're looking for some form of re-engagement. For the next administration to come in and say, okay, we need to work more closely together on external threats. I think that's a key important conclusion there. Yes, back there.
Marwa Mazia at the University of Washington. It seems to me that Turkey was completely absent from the conversation. in my own work, I look at, of course, you mentioned non-state actors and the erosion of the state, and I agree with all of that, of course. But it seems to me once we talk about the Middle East, we either talk about the Arab core, the previously Arab core, the Iraq and Syria and Egypt and Saudi Arabia. But on the periphery of that is Turkey, Iran, of course, and also Israel. So this competition between the Arab states and the non-Arab states within the Middle East seems to be at the core of what's going on. Iraq and Syria have either been Iranified or actually Turkified as well. And when you talk about, I was paying attention when you talk about Saudi Arabia being what Islam means and trying to kind of rescue what that stands for, Emirates and other Arab countries. I think there is a competition over what Islam is to mean between Iran and also Turkey, and to some extent, of course, Egypt and Azhar. There is a competition over what is the future of what is Islam going to be between these countries. So if you can kind of broaden the perspective a little bit and see where Turkey fits in all.
Do you want to direct that question to anyone in particular?
Actually, to Ambassador Youssef and also to perhaps the CIA former.
I think your observation is correct. Turkey is a major player, but I always refer, my default position is the Middle East when I talk about Arab countries, Arab-speaking countries, and so when I say Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and the UAE, that's the core team. Turkey, of course, is a very, very important partner, and I don't think anyone could understand how to deal with ISIS without bringing Turkey into the conversation. Now, how does Islam evolve? I have no idea. I don't know the answer. I don't know where we are and how Islam is perceived. But I do know that there is no other Mecca or Medina. You know, Turkey is an important country, and President Erdogan obviously holds an Islamic flag when he speaks. But there is no other Mecca and Medina. That's not going to be replicated anywhere else. And so I don't think the influence of those two places is going to be challenged anytime soon.
Michael, do you want to add in, just to clarify, former CIA, not Hillary Clinton?
Correct. Correct. I would just add, I mean, I agree 100% with what you said about Turkey's importance to the region, and it's a mistake to talk about the region and not talk about Turkey. You know, Turkey has some of the similar ambitions that Iran has for influence in the region, right? Reestablishment of a different kind of empire than the Iranians are searching for. The Turks don't use the same kind of behavior, right? That to the extent the Iranians do, the Turks do not use the same kind of behavior, malign behavior. I think that's something to be watched. I think, in some sense, U.S. policy is a bit torn on it because it's not in the interests of our Arab allies, but it is in our interest in terms of pushing back on the Iranians to have more Turkish influence. So I think we're a bit torn on it. I would tell you that I think now President Erdogan is more interested in his own image than he is in Turkey's future. He reminds me a little bit of Vladimir Putin in that regard. And I think Turkey would be better off if he was concerned about the future of the Turkish economy and the Turkish society rather than how Turkey is perceived in the world and how he is perceived. Leave it at that.
Great, thanks. We have a bunch of hands in 10 more minutes. Hisham, right in front of you, right there.
Apropos the previous question.
We know you can speak loudly, but use the mic and tell us who you are.
I can belt the blues, I know. Remember, Brian, last year you had a function with
Who are you? Tell us.
You had a function with Joschka Fischer, and he said something interesting. He said that the Middle East now is less Arab than it used to be. And I think the crux of the problem for the Arabs, and I know that the Arabs don't like to hear this, especially from an Arab, is the fact that the Arab core has been framed. Egypt has marginalized itself. And now the Arabs in the last decade or two have been living in the shadows of the non-Arab states in the region. Iran, Turkey, and Israel. There is no Arab core anymore. And that's why now there's that much pressure on the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia and UAE and others, to stand up to Iran. There was a time when Egypt could compete with Iran. Egypt cannot even influence Gaza, let alone influence the Arab East or the Gulf,
Great.
or even North Africa. So the Arab core is fraying. And part of the reason we have this Arab malaise and lack of leadership is precisely this. Egypt has marginalized itself. Iraq is falling apart, literally.
Yeah.
You cannot talk about Iraq the way we used to talk about it. And Syria is literally in flame. The old people here remember when Patrick Seal wrote the classic book, The Struggle for Syria, when he talked about the struggle between the Hashemites in Iraq and the Naserites in Egypt. If you control Syria, you control the Arab world.
Yeah.
In the last 10, 15 years, the Iranians and the Turks have been competing to influence the future of Iraq and in Syria. That's the crux of the Arab world, and that's the problem.
So Habibi, do you have a question? This is Hisham Malham.
No, I mean, let's. I mean, I think can we? I mean,
Get a reaction to that.
I want Yusuf and Ambassador Awad to deal with this issue.
No, Hisham,
My friend.
all due respect, this is a perfect question for our American friends to answer. You have two Arab diplomats here. I would let our American friends answer that one.
And I would add it's more than a malaise. It's like you're being very diplomatic. We're in Go ahead, Mike.
No, I'm good.
I mean, look, just briefly, we're going to take two last questions. But if you read our report, I mean, I think your analysis and what we try to say in there about the region, and there's a section in there that is an attempt at a clinical analysis of what's going on in the region. And there's certainly, I think, fragmentation that's happening. And when I think Michael or someone talked about Iran's hegemonic desires, I am suspicious that anyone can be a hegemon in the current structure that we have of fragmentation in the region when there are these tensions. I think they have that desire, but whether they can actually achieve it is a real question. And the other point I would say, and we've talked about this before, Hisham, is that I think part of our recent analysis is that the US actually has, compared to any other outside power, a network of partnerships that is stronger, much more diverse than certainly Russia, certainly China, or anyone in Europe. But what we need is sort of a clearer idea of where we're going in the long run rather than in reaction to different crises like Daesh. Maybe we'll take two last questions really quickly. This gentleman with the beard has been very, very, very patient, and down here front. Sorry.
Thank you. Munjid Awad from the Center of the Study of Islam and Democracy. What is wrong with us bringing the Middle East under the banner of freedom, democracy, respect of human rights? Why are we afraid of letting the will of the people that spoke years ago during the Arab Spring, let it rise? Let people elect their leaders and respect each other. And I think that would be, why are we afraid of democracy?
Okay. And down here, down front. Take these two.
Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group. I'm going to step a little bit outside my comfort zone, which is economic policy, and ask maybe the ambassadors, but the whole panel. When we defeat ISIL, what's the long-term situation? What are we looking at? We're looking at a sort of a low-level insurgency, terrorist attack. What's the best solution that you see in the long term when the big battle is over?
Maybe we can take the second question first and then come back to the second question, first question. But Michael, in your book, you actually talk about, towards the end, the fragmented nature of the challenges that ahead, and it places strain on the system. But maybe all of you can talk about that, and then we'll circle back to the question of what is wrong with freedom and democracy. I have my own views on that. I don't think anything is, but...
So I think in the aftermath of losing the caliphate, to the coalition, which will happen without a doubt, ISIS will fold back into being a terrorist group. And it started out as a terrorist group. It started out as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It will go back to being a terrorist group both in Iraq and Syria. And it will not be defeated until there is a political solution in both countries, and the proper approach is taken to it. Intelligence, the fusion of intelligence and action can deal with it. But without those two things, it will continue in the shadows for a long time.
Yeah, and I think, let's say, we liberate Mosul, we liberate Raqqa. There's going to be some element of reconstruction and rebuilding and UNDP money going in and rebuilding infrastructure. We're not going to succeed unless we deal with the issue of governance and with the issue of inclusivity. If the Shia militias come in and commit atrocities on behalf of government X or Y, guess what? You're just going to encourage more recruitments into ISIS and other groups. And so unless people that live there feel that they have a stake in its success, that feel that they have a voice, that feel that they belong to this system, we're going to have the same problem. So while I think the reconstruction is the easy part to address, I think getting the mindset and inclusivity of governing as a country, as a diverse country, is the larger challenge that we're going to face.
Can I add just a point to what has been mentioned, and which is something that His Majesty keeps repeating. He keeps saying, be careful that this ISIL problem does not immigrate elsewhere. And it's something that needs to also be kept in mind. Because if they are defeated in Iraq, if eventually they'll be defeated in Syria, we have to make sure that they don't go elsewhere as a terrorist organization. But that will continue for a long time. Therefore, it's very important that everybody puts in the fight and be careful that all the agencies cooperate.
Yeah, on the second question, I would go back to what I said earlier, and that if you believe, as I do, that the problem of violent extremism is a generational problem, that the Muslim world will solve itself. It will have to. Just in the same way the Soviet Union collapsed of its own internal contradictions, this, I believe, will happen when young Muslims realize that this isn't doing us any good. I'm not getting a stake. I'm not getting a spouse. I don't have anything to live for. This is not working. Let's try something else. So there are two derivative questions from there. One is, how do we protect ourselves while this is happening, which is where most of the energy is put. The second question is, how do we hasten this day? How do we identify the underlying causes? And there are probably 5, 6, 7 distinct but interrelated underlying causes of this phenomenon that will mostly have to be addressed by the Muslim community, but with which we can help. And I think that's the real question. It's not defeating ISIL and what comes next. Yes, that will happen, but it's really what is the long-term addressal of the economic pieces, of the informational pieces, of the governance pieces, of the justice pieces, of the assimilation pieces all around the world. It's a large question that we really have to come at, or we will never solve this. To the second question, nothing wrong with democracy. I just think that we have to understand that when it's a step function going from non-democracy to full democracy, very often you can end up with a mutant form. Sometimes a sudden change works. Other times it falls apart. I would use Egypt as an example, in which when elections were held, the only party that was well enough organized to win that election was the Muslim Brotherhood. They were organized throughout the country. So of course they won the election over other more moderate parties. They just couldn't get their act together in time. And we ended up with a mutant form, I think, of democracy in that case. So I think it's a long-term goal. Yusuf himself has told me, long-term, yeah, okay, fine. But I think we have to take it at a measured pace, pushing but not too hard, lest we get a mutant form.
And and also to add to this question on democracy, it's very important for the security of any country, and obviously all the reforms we're trying to do is to have this democracy, participative democracy of everybody. And it's very important that the system and the institutions are prepared for it, which everybody is trying to do. But also, the other aspect of democracy is the culture. And the culture is for people to get used to understanding that democracy is not always just asking, but also giving, and the responsibility that you have for the state. And we're all at this stage when there's complete confusion, and where people are like in this euphoria of free speech and wanting to ask for this, that, but they do not realize, first of all, that they also have a responsibility as citizens. There's nothing called democracy without that responsibility, and that different things have to be put and set in place for it to become successful. But definitely, there's nothing wrong with it.
And I just wanted to add my 2 cents, and our report covers this, but this issue, I think, is important for many of the reasons we discussed earlier when we were talking about violent extremism. I'm of the view, and I've lived and worked in the region for 20 years, unless you actually have greater respect for pluralism and a deeper sense of ideas and a clash of ideas, we can't just be countering violent extremism by taking down, tweets and going after groups. There actually has to be some confidence in a system that allows flourishing of different ideas, and we sort of articulate that. It's, I think, a hard thing to do, but I think it's important for the U.S. to keep it on the agenda, because Russia isn't going to do it. China certainly isn't going to do it. The 2 o'clock hour is upon us. In 90 minutes, we did it. We solved the Middle East. So you're welcome. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel of experts for a great discussion. Good to see you.
Good job. Good job.